I feel like that was a trick question. Jesus is the most influential person in my life. But I figure that's a universal. It's so good to see you all. I've so enjoyed my time out here. I'm so struck. This is my second time to Ann Arbor. I'm struck by a couple things. One, good food. Two, you have an amazing community. This is a resource I wouldn't take for granted that you've got, for one thing, Be Love Revolution, that you've got this building, the space to get together, that you've got this team of people with hearts dedicated to befriending you in partnership, mentorship, friendship, and love, and also in brotherhood and sisterhood. It's just it's something to not take for granted. I pray for all people to have older friends walk alongside them in their journey, because there's so much that we don't know at any particular point in our lives, and it's really easy to be confused and really easy to get into the fog of the time in which we live and not be able to see past it. And I think that as rational beings and human beings, and also Catholics, which I think most of us are, we are called to really pursue intensely with a great love what is true. Really pursue what is true. And I think the truth in some ways has gotten a bit of a bad rap, right? There's oftentimes a wave that we kind of in a popular culture have of pitting truth against love, as though they are a dichotomy, or I think it's a false dichotomy. We know that God loves truth in our heart. And we know when we don't have the truth, when we start from something false, then it can take us in really, really bad places, places that we might not even imagine that we can end up in. If you're an architect or an engineer building a bridge or a building, and if you get your dimensions and your whatever the formulas, I'm not an engineer, obviously, you get your little special formulas wrong, and even if it's off just a little bit, as you establish that foundation, as you build that building, eventually the bridge can collapse, the building can fall, things can go horribly askew. So God loves truth in the heart. And this is why we strive so deeply as Catholics to see ourselves with reality. I think this is so foundational. The Catholic Church prompts us to do an examination of conscience. How am I doing? How am I really doing? It's really easy just to think, I'm okay. You know what? I was really mad at that person. I treated someone badly, but you know what? I deserve to, because they were just not being quite right to me, or, what have you. We justify ourselves all the time. And we do it habitually, to the point where if we're not daily examining how we're doing, we're going to become too far afield to really easily see the state of our soul. And so that's why the church, and out of love and mercy, really prompts us to be looking at ourselves. Also prompts us to look at ourselves in confessional, right? That this is a place where, I don't care how old you are or how even minor your sins are. It's humbling. It's humbling to look at yourself and say, you know what, there are things that are not quite right in my life, and I can't blame it on someone else. I have to blame it on me, but then that's also hopeful, right? Because it's horrible and hopeful. It's horrible because we have to see our faults, but it's so hopeful because we get to contend with our faults, right? And this is the only way that we get ourselves to become strong and ultimately happy, is by being willing to see our faults and also being willing to contend with them. So I'm so excited to talk to you guys tonight, because you are the Be Love Revolution. And so I'm thinking that love is central to the mission. And I know that's just for the ladies, but boys, we can pretend like we're the Be Love Revolution too. I think you guys are Zion, right? Yeah. Woo! There we go. There's a Zion over there. So I want to think about that, the name love, Be Love. And it's sort of there's a language capture that's happened, even I think, with the word love. Such a simple, foundational, and yet far-reaching and profound word. But today it's oftentimes reduced to a slogan. And I think it's important to think about sloganeering. So here, what are some slogans to deal with that use the word love? Love wins, love is love, hate has no home here. I think these immediately conjure in our minds the LGBTQ movement, right? That love wins. That means, that it's a the LGBTQ movement. That love is love, meaning it doesn't matter who you love. It doesn't matter the sex of the other person that you love. Love should not be limited in any way. It should not be, defined in any way. It really can be whatever we want it to be, which actually means that it doesn't actually mean anything. But we talk about that more. And so, I think that we want to treat carefully what that word means, because part of the problem of slogans is they keep us from really thinking deeply. There was a German philosopher named Hannah Arendt who attended something called the Nuremberg trials. Anyone know what the Nuremberg trials were? So this was after Nazi Germany. There were trials to, they put many of the engineers, including the propagandists and scientists who were experimenting on human bodies and guilty of countless murders, on trial. And a lot of the former Nazis appealed and defended themselves based on, well, this was what I was told to do. This is what I believed I was supposed to do. And what the Nuremberg doctrine that eventually came out of those trials determined was, it doesn't matter what you're told to do or what you think based on the time and the environment in which you are told is good. There's a law that transcends human law, and human laws are only just insofar as they are in harmony with this higher law, the natural law, the moral law, and ultimately the eternal law. The law means something, has to be rooted in something outside of a particular person's order, outside of a particular time period, that we have to be people who are seeking the truth and the just action, despite whatever fog of ideology in which we live. So we have to make sure that we're pushing past slogans. And it's hard to do that, right? Because when somebody says, love is love, love wins, well, then if I'm the person who says, I believe that marriage is one man and one woman and, for life and fidelity and for the sake of nurturing children and not just an adult romantic relationship, but rather meant to be fruitful insofar as we are able to biologically. Well, what does it mean if I have that belief, the belief that the Catholic Church proposes? Well, it means all of a sudden that I am therefore on the side of hatred. And this is pretty much a big problem for a Christian, right? Because love is not incidental to what we believe. It's not peripheral to what we believe. It's at the very core of what we believe, because it's not just about what we believe. It's about who we believe and who we believe in, who happens to be love himself. And so we have to be really careful with the way that this ideology is claiming the territory of love for something that is utterly opposed to love himself. So how do we be sure that we're clinging to the truth and also clinging to love, and do it in the way that walks through the world with our peers, with people who are not Catholic, with teachers who might not be, as supportive of what we believe, with our neighbors who might think differently? How do we handle, this great divide without harming sort of our call, our mandate to be people who embody love to our neighbor, people of compassion, people who walk with the suffering, walk with the marginalized? And I think the one thing that we have to understand is that we want to be people who make our compassion and our love actually have a helpful difference, right? Love means to will the good of the other human being. Love doesn't mean I never make you feel bad, or I never contradict you, or I never disagree with you, or I never cause offense, right? We should never be seeking to cause offense for the sake of causing offense, but there are things, but the foundation of love is not confirming everything the other person thinks, desires, and believes. It's actually loving them enough to will their good. If somebody is starving of thirst in the desert and somebody keeps insisting that there's a cup of poison and we better just help that person because they don't know it's poison and they got to drink it and they really want it and it's going to seem like a remedy, well, that answer is never to give them a cup of poison. The answer is to go find them a cup of water, right? So we want our actions of love and our behavior of love and our belief system to be something that actually helps the human person and wills their good. We don't empower people by infantilizing them, by confirming them that all of their beliefs and their desires are always and only right, and that's the only action of love. And I think we see in the scriptures and the gospels in particular that Christ allows followers to walk away from him when he declares that his body is true food and blood is true wine. And he doesn't chase after them. He doesn't recant. He doesn't fear that he might have caused them to walk away. He knows that he is the truth, and that in that truth that they can come back to him, right? That there is always the ability, even if somebody is temporarily offended, you've given them seeds and tools that eventually might lead them back. So what is the poison that I would say that the woke movement asks us to offer people in a way that makes it unloving? Well, I think first and foremost, there's points of agreement, right? There really is true suffering. There really has been historic, deep injustices against women, against people of racial minorities, that these things are real, and we want to say first and foremost that we agree. We agree that there's injustice. We agree that there's suffering, and we agree that that needs to be addressed. We don't paper over that, and we don't pretend that that doesn't exist in an ongoing way as well. But the harm that I think that the woke movement fundamentally is doing is that it's redefining a person in two particular ways, and both ways tell the human person that they don't really mean anything. And so I want to talk about those two ways and then talk about some ways that we can respond to it. So the first way that the human person is redefined as is, I'm going to say this phrase, and when you remember it, maybe some of you have heard of it. The person is given a collectivized identity. Has anyone heard that term, collectivized identity? Okay. The human person, we're obsessed with what our identity is now, and that's understandable. Everyone wants to know who am I, what gives me meaning, what makes me distinctive, what makes me irreplaceable, and traditionally that would be given to you through the introduction into family life. There's a reason why one of the first acts of family life is to name the child, because it gives a signifier that this is a particular person. This is not one in a series. This is not, I'm not a number, like 11 in Stranger Things or whatever. That's the horror of her being named 11, is that it means she's not a real person with dignity. She's a totem, or understood to be a totem by the people who are naming her that. So we normally receive our identity in this way. And this is the manner that, that family life is such a particular target for the woke movement. And I go into that in my book. I'm not going to get into the history and stuff tonight. But the family and the faith are traditionally the greatest obstacles to this type of revolution that is inherent to the ideology, which is a revolutionary ideology. Instead of having an identity that is founded in being sons, daughters, familial relationships, both human and divine, supernatural family, as well as our human family, and the families that we go on to create. So even if we don't have a great family, we can define ourselves again by, becoming a father, becoming mother. And in fact, each of you already is potential father and mother. That's part of your deepest identity too. But instead of these identities, we're given a different type of identity. We are not defined by the love that we receive as a son or a daughter. We're not defined by the love of God, but rather by the hatred of society. So we're defined into division, either the hatred that surrounds us or the hatred that's in our heart. And this is a definition that rejects that there's a universal human nature. This is really opposed to, for example, the civil rights movement of the 1960s under Martin Luther King Jr., who believed and preached quite beautifully about natural law, that his letter from Birmingham jail. So during the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King Jr., one of the battle cries of the people fighting for justice, racial justice, was, "I am a man." And this did not mean, as our modern ear might hear it, I'm a man as opposed to a woman, but rather I am a human being. I am not less than you. I am not more than you. I am the same as you, and I deserve equal rights and equal dignity. This is juxtaposed very starkly with the new woke anti-racist movement of today, of the Kimberly Crenshaws, Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo's, which says that we are not defined in ways that make us brothers or universal. We are centering the division at the core of my being. So if you try to say that you're going to be colorblind, which, colorblind, I think it gets a bad rap now in this ideology, because they say, you have to see you're rejecting the oppression that's the core of me. So if you say you're colorblind, you're pretending like you don't see the fact that I've suffered. Well, okay, we always obviously are not blind to the surface realities of the human person. I see what my friend looks like, I see what this person looks like and what that person looks like. But the process of friendship and love and universal dignity is that those things start to fall away, right? You might know a really beautiful woman, but maybe she's really catty or really mean or really gossipy. She begins to take on less beauty, even physical beauty in our eyes, right? Because we see a bit of the soul. Meanwhile, someone who might be seen like a really plain man or something, maybe we get to know him and he's extremely witty and extremely kind. And doesn't he take on a bit more handsomeness, because of that soul that we see in him? This is the process of getting to know the whole of the person, is that we begin to see beyond the physical attributes and see more deeply. So does this help? This idea that the person becomes defined by oppression in society, hatred of mankind, does this help a person find meaning in their life? I'm going to tell a quick story about a young boy who was born, second child of a teenage mother, in 1948 on the swamp shores of Georgia in a wood shack with no electricity and no plumbing, insulated by newspapers. He knew a type of poverty that most of us won't experience even for an hour, much less a childhood. This boy was finally abandoned by his father. His mother couldn't no longer take care of him nor his brother, so his grandfather took him in. His grandfather had a slightly better living experience. He had actual insulation. He had, real flooring, not dirt flooring, and he was able to give him an education. His grandfather's rather stern, and when he started going to school, he said his grandfather's also illiterate, and he said to him, and this little boy experienced deep racism. This is the Deep South, and the height of the Deep South racism. Well, not the height, but while it was extremely hot. And he said to him all throughout his school years until the time he's in adulthood, you do not give me an excuse for any single thing that happens. Bad things will happen to you. Injustice will befall you. People will treat you badly. I don't want to hear ever any word that any of that is an excuse. Now, maybe that's a little extreme, a little too stern. This young boy, he took it seriously. He feared a bit his grandfather, and so he brought home A's, and he didn't miss a day of school, and he did what he was supposed to do, and he tried not to be wayward. And then at some point, it was too much, and he kind of freaked out and escaped the city as a young man, and joined sort of a Marxist ideology. It became violent. He started engaging in some riots in the streets. And then after rioting all night for 2 nights in a row, he found himself in the door of the Catholic Church, and he went inside and he knelt down. He was exhausted, and he prayed a prayer that he would never forget, which was, God, please take this hatred away from me. I'm so tired of hating everything. I'm mad at this. I'm mad at that. I'm mad at these people. I'm mad at the system. I'm mad. And he prayed and he prayed and prayed. And he wound up going to a Catholic school where the nuns treated him with real dignity, with real respect. And he kept going and he kept going. He wound up becoming one of the most influential Supreme Court justices that we've ever had. His name's Clarence Thomas. If any biography that you read of anyone who has experienced hardship or hard circumstances, there's only one way that they transcend those circumstances, one human way. And that's by someone telling them in their life that they can assume responsibility over the things that they can assume responsibility for. And this gives great purpose to our actions, right? And the biggest cause of despair of this first redefinition is that the woke movement will say any injustice or disparity between identity groups is only and always attributable to discrimination. And what does that mean? That means that any ways in which I don't measure up or any ways that things go wrong for me is attributable to one thing and one thing only, the injustice of something outside of me. My successes, my failures, it's all attributable to some systemic forces of which I have no control. So my only response is to rage against them, to try to destroy them, to try to protest, throw tomato soup on art or whatever people do now to protest. And this means that it doesn't matter what I do when I wake up in the morning. It doesn't matter if I sleep in. It doesn't matter if I put in effort. It doesn't matter if I put my blood, sweat, and tears into my life, into the details of my day. It doesn't matter what I do at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. None of this matters because my efforts don't matter, because my life doesn't fundamentally matter. And that is a deeply lie of despair. The second redefinition is that we are defined by our desires, that what I will is unimpeachable. That there is no objective meaning to, for example, sexual desires. There's nothing I ought to desire. There's no desire I ought to deny myself, except for only as long as there's consent, right? That the only metric is consent. You can do whatever activity you want as long as there's consenting parties, because none of it actually means anything, right? And this is called expressive individualism. If you want to look up the technical term, lots of brilliant people have written about this idea, and it's intrinsic in the woke movement. So that our oppression is not only from groups and hierarchies outside of ourselves, but also from our own trained, constructed desire pushed on us by society to conform to some sort of moral law, particularly with regard to our sexuality. And that any hindrance on what I desire is a hindrance on me. And so this is why we start to fuse our identity with our sexual desires, right? And so when somebody says, if you don't use the right pronouns for someone, then you've denied their existence. You're, causing violence to the person. Well, in a way, according to this metric, that is true because you are what you desire. Um, but the problem is that's just not who we fundamentally are, right? We are not, you don't have, if a man falls in a certain way, or if you say a man commits adultery, he doesn't need a parade and just say, well, I'm so sorry I fell and but I desire this and that's what the heart wanted. And so no, we'd better just march and have pride in that because I don't want to feel ashamed that I did that. I don't want to feel ashamed because my heart wanted what it wanted. It's making our desires omniscient as though they were a God. And I think we all know, have experience, whether or not it's whatever desire it is, even outside this realm. If we are constantly giving our desires authority over our decisions, we're going to become slaves to them in about 20 seconds, right? If I indulge every desire I have, then I'm not master of myself. I cannot unite I cannot conform my will to what I understand to be my good. How will I get in shape? How will I ever run a marathon? How will I ever write a book? How will I ever get a PhD? How will I ever achieve any of my dreams, right? We know in this realm, every other realm except for sex, that suffering well for something to be good for you is a virtue, right? So we we train for the marathon, we go to medical school, we go and try to become, get trained to be an artist, whatever we do. We try to be an amazing mom. We come to the Be Revolution. Sometimes doing things requires that we identify what is our good, and then we conform our desires to it. And the fundamental meaninglessness that the second redefinition introduces to us, it tells us that our bodies are fundamentally meaningless. And I think we're seeing this played out now in a very acute way with the transgender movement. I was just reading a story of this young woman, Chloe Cole, who at 13, she was deeply depressed and insecure and had been sexually abused. And she began to question whether or not she was a girl at all. And at 13, she began puberty blockers and wound up having chronic joint pain because of the bone density that the puberty blockers caused in her. By 15, she had a double mastectomy. And when she took the bandages off and looked down at her body, she didn't feel like she was looking at herself as a boy as she wanted. She felt like she was looking at herself as a monster. And she had been betrayed by medical experts, betrayed by adults who allowed this to happen. And by this age of 16, she was desperate to undo it all. In other words, I'm not saying this to be dramatic, other than to say there's real human harms and consequences that bad ideas end up leading us into. It's not just the transgender movement as well, it's also the sexual revolution in core form. As I was saying earlier, if sex is casual, if it has no meaning, then that means that fundamentally my body has no meaning. And any woman who is engaged in casual sex and regretted it, feels used, knows that something was done to her body. It was not just done to her body, it was done to her. And that her body's not separate from her. But if we want to say that we can make our bodies be anything, mean anything, we're fundamentally telling people that your body means nothing, which also means that you mean nothing, because so integral is our body to ourselves. So again, it promises compassion, but it's leading people to despair. And I think the statistics bear it out. The increase of despair, suicide, mental illness is not only and always attributable to this, but this is certainly, this radical ideology cannot not be a factor. So what do we do? I see I'm getting into time. So I think there's a couple of wrong responses and then one right one. One wrong one is that we might be too afraid of this idea. It's too political. We're worried about ruining our friendships, our mission field. We don't want to harm people. We want to lead them to Christ. And so we don't want to make them upset or think that we're haters. And so we disengage. The conversation is too fraught. We don't want to engage in it. And so we just sort of put our heads down. I think that's a mistake for a very particular reason, which is, well, everything I just said, that this is a movement of despair, but also because it's not just a political movement. It's redefining very fundamental things about the human person. And if we get it wrong, and if we disengage, those questions are going to be answered by someone else. So we need to be at the forefront of answering what a human person is. The second way that I think is a mistake is that we fight it as though we're a mirror image of the very ideology which we're trying to conquer, right? In other words, we become tribalistic ourselves. We become, hardcore right-wingers who make fun of people and conflate the person espousing an ideology with our hatred for the ideology itself, and we lose the dignity of the person in front of us. So I think there's a third way, and I think the third way is that we need to love the person and fight the revolution. And I think that the former requires the latter. I don't think we can truly love the person unless we're fighting a revolution that's telling them that they mean nothing. So I think we need to stand up for that. A few just practical things. I think that it's easy to compromise on principle. I would make sure that we understand what lines we are not crossing. And one line I would encourage you not to cross is don't participate in lies. So I would never use someone's pronouns that were not not in accord with his or her sex. I wouldn't use someone's new name if they want to change their name. I wouldn't participate in that. And I wouldn't necessarily make a grand show or performance about not participating about it. I would say, well, I will not do that because I'm a Catholic, But maybe I would do it subtly and just try to avoid it. And maybe the question would be posed to me and I'd have to give an answer. And then I would say, simply, without emotion, that this is something I cannot do. And I think we can say the truth simply, without fear, without I'm so sorry, without a bunch of performative humility or sheepishness, nor with swagger and bravado. Just simply, I love you, and I don't think it's good to confirm you in something that I don't think is true. I used the example earlier today that if a group of very thin women were coming up to me screaming and demanding that I tell them that they're fat because they're anorexic, it's not loving for me to tell them that they're fat, right? I think everyone would agree with that. But because we're so in the sea and in the air of this ideology, I think it's hard for us to see it accurately. Okay, secondly, just a couple more. Be a good friend, right? A really good friend. I think most of you guys are probably really good about that. And I think this group is probably really good about encouraging you to do that. So I don't want to dwell on that too much, other than to say we should be affirming the good that we see in our friendships across, even if we disagree with them deeply, we should be having fun with them, but knowing that fun is not the purpose of our friendship. Thirdly, leadership. That leadership means that we call people forth, that we, and also that we model it. So we need to be becoming strong, right? Becoming strong. We need to live an embodied life of deep, rich meaning. Because if this is a meaningless revolution, then we need to embody what it means to have meaning in our life. And fourth, I'm just going to say one quick thing to the guys in the room, girls. I'm just kidding. I oftentimes say that I think that good men, particularly good fathers, will change the world. And if this revolution is going to be defeated, it's going to be through good men and good fathers. And I know most of you are not fathers yet, but you're potential fathers. And so I want you to think of yourselves that way. Potential spiritual fathers, potential biological fathers. That means that, potential fathers don't entertain lightly the heart of a woman, and they don't risk the life of a child through activity that might wind up in a baby that can then be disposed of. And I want you to understand and be encouraged about what true masculinity is. I think the culture oftentimes tells us that the really manly man is the football player, or the basketball player, or the rock star, the politician. There's a definition that St. Thomas Aquinas gives about what emasculation is. And it's not someone who's not in shape, and it's not someone who's pale or thin. Emasculation is a man who is unwilling to forgo his pleasure for the sake of something good. So in other words, the truly manly man is the virtuous man, the holy man. And I just want to leave you with that, not to criticize you or to be judgmental in any way, because obviously I don't know. I assume you all amazing men, but just to encourage you, because good men, I think, will change this way, lead us out of this. There are consequences. There can be consequences to speaking out and to taking a line and to not compromising on principle. And I felt them myself. I had a deep friendship that went quite awry because of the stuff I was writing, a friendship that I valued my whole life. And she publicly came after me, and it was very hurtful and confusing. And I finally realized the only thing that we have to fear is God. And if we don't fear him, we will fear everything else. So don't fear offending someone. try not to. That's not your point. But if it happens, it's going to happen. It's not about you. It's out of your control. If you've made sure that you're acting out of love, then the consequences will be out of your control. But don't fear that. Don't fear offending people. Don't fear the consequences. Fear what happens if you don't stand up for truth and don't stand with God. Thanks.